an attachment of the spike of the COVID virus into that ACE receptor. Well, what some antivirals do is hope to block that, make sure that connection didn't happen. Another way an antiviral agent might work is that it might interrupt cell entry, or once it gets into the cell, doesn't let it travel to the nucleus. They call that intracellular trafficking. Block that movement of the virus either into the cell or through the cell. And then another way antivirus works is RNA replication. I call it breaking the strand of the RNA so the virus can't reproduce. Then you have treatments. Treatments are simply that, drugs that treat various COVID-19 illnesses resulting from the COVID viral infection. That's where my focus is. And finally, you have vaccines. Vaccines are preventative, prophylactic therapeutics, preventing you getting COVID by creating a false type of immunity as if you already had gotten COVID. Next slide. We'll now go over a quick overview. I'm sorry, next slide again. We're going to do a quick overview of vaccine concepts. So most human medicines, including vaccines, are small molecules or proteins. Now, a decade ago, a company called Moderna was developed on the concept of messenger RNA as a prevailing therapy. That's all they did, RNA type drugs. Now, prior to the use of messenger RNA specifically, there were 2 RNA-based therapies that are approved already in the pipeline. They weren't messenger RNA, but they were RNA-based. Now, others have been pursuing messenger RNA as an approach towards dealing with COVID-19. However, Moderna is a front runner. According to the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, Moderna has an impressive drug pipeline utilizing messenger RNA technology as the sole platform to address rare metabolic disorders, cancer, heart failure, and a host of other pathogens like, remember Zika, the Zika virus, Epstein-Barr virus, as well as the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. Now, the premise of any vaccine is to induce a long-lived immune memory in the form of B and T cells. Now, upon any encounter with a pathogen, which can be bacteria or virus, these cells recognize the danger and fight it off by destroying the pathogen and the pathogen-infected cells. The danger signal is an antigen. An antigen is formed after contact with a pathogen. So the pathogen is the bad guy, and the antigen is sort of like the person who wants revenge. I'm here, I survived, and I'm going to be ready if you ever come back. So pathogen and antigen. The antigen notifies the immune system of a pathogen. The antigen is what says, hey, they're back. Let's get them. We're going to beat them this time. So for SARS-CoV-2, the antigen targeted by B and T cells is usually a protruding spike protein. So think of the virus as, I think of it as a sticker burr. You're walking through the grass and this thing sticks you. It has barbs all the way around it. That's kind of what the coronavirus looks like. So the antigen targets this protruding spike protein that's on the surface of the virus. The challenge in vaccination is inducing this antigen response without getting people really sick, because it's the antigen peptide presented in this interaction that determines the target of the immune response. Next slide. Let's continue our quick overview of vaccine concepts. So what is a vaccine? A vaccine imitates the infection to give the immune system a preview of the disease. Vaccination became a public health tool after Edward Jenner showed in 1796, that inoculation with the less virulent cowpox could prevent smallpox. After his son's death from smallpox, Benjamin Franklin regretted his decision not to inoculate his son with it. Today, vaccines are widely credited for the prevention and eradication of many of once feared deadly diseases. Common vaccines are weakened or inactivated versions of the virus, like the yearly flu or the polio vaccine children receive 2 months after birth. Remember that, that's key. That's a key difference. Messenger RNAs are engineered molecules. Standard common vaccines that we've all known about, grown up with, they are actually weakened or deactivated particulate matter from an actual virus. All right, so one is biologic material and the other is more synthetic genetic material. Next slide, please. Now, newer vaccines utilize other engineered, well-studied doses containing specific regions of the target pathogen to create specific immune responses. I'm giving you some keywords here: engineered and specific. Now, Moderna's challenger in the race for a COVID-19 vaccine is engineered specific. AstraZeneca's vaccine candidate is a non-replicating, weakened version of the common cold virus that contains the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. One is engineered, one is biologic in reference. So AstraZeneca's vaccine is different from Moderna's vaccine because it is more biologic in origin. This approach has been successful before as the first Ebola vaccine. So Ebola was a horrible scare. During a different administration, there was a team they called the Pandemic Task Force, I believe. And their job was to find out where there was a potential pandemic and deal with it over there. So we had teams of people that went to the origin of Ebola, which was, I believe, somewhere in Africa, and they addressed it there. But the vaccine that they developed was biologic in nature versus genetic synthesis in nature. For SARS-CoV-2, the surface spike protein is the most common target to be tested for vaccines. Next slide. So I've tried to make clear to you the difference. Every time I speak, I want to give the audience news they can use and information they might want to share about self-care. In this area, this arena, the self-care is simply knowledge. Know the difference between the vaccines. If you're interested, not interested, would like to wait, just know the difference between the vaccines. I want you to know which ones are genetic in nature or synthesized and which ones are more biologic and how they were developed. But here's another key difference between synthesized and genetic and developed from biologic material. One takes a lot longer to develop versus the other. My dad used to say slow and steady can win the race, because I was a kid that always wanted to rush. I was always, Dad, when? How much longer? How much longer? He would say slow and steady wins the race, because you build discipline through taking your time, actually. But in the case of these vaccines, slow and steady can still win the race, but in the case of a global health crisis, people kind of want you to go a little bit faster if you can. Now, vaccines prepare the immune system by generating disease-fighting proteins called antibodies. These antibodies seek out and attack if the real infectious virus ever shows up. Traditional vaccines against viruses are either weakened versions of the whole virus that are unable to cause disease, biologic, weakened viruses, okay, or they are made from signature viral proteins called antigens that then spark an immune response. An antigen in the new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is the crown-like spike S protein through which the virus latches to the lung, remember the connection I talked about, and respiratory cells. However, developing vaccines based on viral proteins is a slow process because of the difficulties in producing pure proteins at medical standards in large quantities. Think of growing roses or growing your food. It's a lot faster to run to the market. Now scientists have developed a different type of vaccine, the messenger RNA vaccines. And the messenger RNA vaccines have a biological code that reads the cells and translates to make their own proteins. Instead of traditional viral protein vaccines, and messenger RNA or mRNA vaccine provides this synthetic copy of mRNA coding individual proteins from the virus. The host body is able to produce the viral protein itself instead of trying to grow it or cultivate it, if you will. The mRNA vaccines can be developed much faster and be introduced into the body to work much quicker. The presence of the protein kicks off the body's immune system to fight the virus, the same as with other vaccines, just at a much faster rate. Dr. Murray, next slide, please. So here's a pictograph of what I've been trying to describe concerning the synthetic development of viral protein creation from within our own cells. A messenger RNA vaccine provides a patient's cells with a messenger RNA to create proteins from SARS-CoV-2, which cause an immune response. Joshua Peters with the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology had this to say: rather than giving a person a protein vaccine, researchers are giving them messenger RNA, which is the biological code that the cells read and translate to make their own proteins. Rather than provide a vaccine made from viral proteins, Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine is composed of synthetic messenger RNA. Now, these molecules are injected into people and cellular protein-making machines called ribosomes. They read and translate the messenger RNA. It's these proteins that then trigger an autoimmune response. So instead of traditional viral protein vaccines, a messenger RNA vaccine provides a synthetic copy of messenger RNA coding individual proteins from the virus, which the host body uses to produce a viral protein itself. A big advantage of messenger RNA vaccines is that scientists can skip the laboratory production of proteins by directly injecting the molecular instructions to make the protein into the human body itself. Hooray for vaccines. Next slide. To be a proponent for early treatment of coronavirus infection shouldn't automatically mean there's a disregard for the much needed prevention efforts represented by the messenger RNA vaccines. I'm excited that people who want a vaccine are able to get the vaccine. And the CDC has stated there are a lot of benefits. It will keep us from getting COVID-19. It's a safe way to help build our own internal protection. And it's an important tool to help stop the pandemic. So the vaccines are out there. And here's what I have to say about it. Next slide. Now we wait our turn in line. Isn't it exciting that the news said, finally, they're here, but not for everybody, right? Because that's what they said. They said healthcare workers first. We certainly understand why they would say healthcare workers first, but for people who have a bit of high anxiety about it, is hurry up and wait. What you see before you are the vaccination tiers and population groups for a high or very high level of pandemic severity, which is what we're in now. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has recommended that frontline healthcare workers and residents of long-term care facilities should comprise the first batch of COVID-19 vaccination. Next in line should be people over the age of 75 and non-healthcare essential workers, including first responders, grocery store workers, and transportation workers. But if you take a look at that list, everybody else is sort of tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. Greater than 75 is supposed to be in the first group, but greater than 65, just take a look from left to right. Greater than 65 is kind of over to the right. And a lot of people now are working past 65. Before, 65, 62 to 65 was a retirement age, and people would go home if they could, but more and more people are working into their 70s. So if you're trying to still work, if you're blessed to be able to still work, you're still exposed. Something to think about there. So why does early treatment of COVID matter? Because now we have the vaccines, right? Well, the death rate of COVID is actually much lower than the actual infection rate. Something like only 2% or a little less than 3% maximum. This is a good thing, unless the death rate includes one of your loved ones. Then 2% doesn't seem so negligible. Regardless, complications of COVID-19 can be really challenging for clinicians and downright scary for the rest of the public. It's been stated at least 10% of COVID survivors develop after effects for up to 6 months or more. Next slide. Early treatment intervention could potentially reduce the risk of these complications by reducing the progression of COVID to the most serious symptoms and a drastic dash to the local ED, requiring hospital admission as a minimum and intubation for mechanical ventilation as a maximum. What about your place in line? We just reviewed the slide that showed what the lineup was, or the tier was established for who can get this vaccine we've been waiting so long for. I want to bring to mind an Ohio State University study. OSU is known for their football team and some of their other athletic programs as well, but specifically their football team. Well, Ohio State did a study on some student athletes who survived COVID-19 but showed signs of heart disease. There were about 26 student athletes who recovered from COVID. It was a small group, but get this, some had symptoms and some actually were asymptomatic, meaning no headache, no fever, no sniffles, no cough. But myocarditis, that's inflammation of the heart muscle, was observed in 4 or 15% of these student athletes. And in 8 or 30%, the student athletes were observed to have developed cardiac scar tissue. If this is the impact of COVID on young and healthy student athletes, some of whom never developed symptoms, just waiting around until you can't breathe really shouldn't be the only outpatient option. Now, considering your place in line, rather than waiting around for approval from the National Institutes of Health or the Centers for Disease Control, some physicians have at least begun to treat the symptoms of COVID in recognition of the overactivation of the inflammatory response if left unchecked, seeing it as a signal for an advancement of the COVID assault on our bodies. The forecasted intention is to prevent the COVID-triggered advancement in inflammatory response. So what's the rationale for waiting until you need to rush to the emergency room? What is the rationale for not having a purposeful effort to prevent the mad dash to the ER in the first place? Shouldn't we be activated in preventing this progression of an unchecked inflammatory response, especially since we already know how to keep it from happening? We must believe in ourselves and standardize an approach to common COVID symptoms using the current medications already in our FDA-indicated, FDA-approved arsenal. Next slide. I say the house is on fire. Yesterday, the Chicago Sun-Times published an article that said U.S. COVID-19 deaths hit another one-day high at over 4,300. Think about that. Lest we become immune to the numbers, 4,300 people are dead in one day. That number reminds me of 9/11, but that was just one day. The number of Americans killed in World War II was about 407,000. As of yesterday, we were above 386,000. These are the top states seeing the dreaded COVID surge. It should be frightening, not just alarming. If we were living in a house and heard the alarm sound from the smoke detector, there is no way we would say that there has to be a flame before we take any action whatsoever. There is no way you would acknowledge that the smoke will transition from a flame and the flame to a full-on blaze, and only then determine the fire department should be called. My doctor should pursue a focused effort to ensure the origin of the smoke is determined and then implement swift action to address whatever caused the smoke in the first place. We would want to make sure the smoke never, ever became a flame and the flame never allowed to become the dreaded blaze. Yes, without a doubt, we early interventionists are grateful for the new COVID-19 vaccines. The vaccines are a brilliant and valiant effort at a much needed, long-awaited prevention effort to interrupt the plague of COVID across our great nation and our world. Nevertheless, these COVID vaccines are not destined for people who already have COVID at home or in the hospital. The people who are sick at home need prevention too. Prevention from hospitalization. Today, as we exhale and celebrate the release of the vaccine to prevent COVID, there are tens of thousands of Americans who are already COVID positive and not yet hospitalized. By the way, is anybody wondering about the great mutations? Next slide, Dr. Murray. The smoke detector. COVID-19 affects different people in different ways. We know that. Now, the most common symptoms we've heard about: fever, dry cough, tiredness. Nowadays, if somebody has allergies and they sneeze, we're kind of looking at them sideways, right? Hope they don't have the COVID. Now, some of the less common symptoms: the aches and pains, the headache, the loss of taste or smell. Not that common, but not that scary. But the serious symptoms: difficulty breathing or shortness of breath, chest pain or pressure, loss of speech or movement. Let me tell you something. Sometimes when people get to the serious symptoms, you have a stronger chance of them requiring mechanical ventilation. We shouldn't have to wait for that if there's a way to prevent that. Next slide. If you defend the body, the strain won't matter. Think about that. Viruses are dynamic. They are living beings, and they reproduce, and they can reproduce and create safety advantages to prevent their eradication. They don't want to die. They don't want to be stopped from replicating. That is what they feel they were born to do. So when they modify or self-modify or self-mutate, the vaccines are usually challenged to address that because the vaccines were developed with a certain generation in mind, so to speak. So if COVID can be treated by symptom, then the progression of COVID should cease to be a challenge. Here's what I mean. Treating symptomatic expression of COVID before hospitalization bypasses the need for a specific COVID regimen per se. If your patient has a fever, you address it. If there's evidence of pulmonary dysfunction, like coughing or symptoms of bronchitis, for instance, you treat it with the standard go-to corticosteroid. That's the same thing you normally would do for asthma COPD exacerbation, prednisone or methylprednisolone. If there's a concern that steroids could further suppress the immune response, then boost the immune system as a precaution. Is anybody concerned that there's now a whole multiple of new COVID strains reported? If we focus on active management of the symptoms within FDA indications and approval, of course, we have a strong likelihood of avoiding the most severe consequences of the infection. What I'm saying here is you deal with the more common and even less common symptoms and prevent the transition to the more severe symptoms. These efforts are only until the rest of the country has access to the vaccines. However, if essential workers and long-term care or nursing home residents are the appropriate priority, there has to be a mitigation plan for treating COVID patients until all who want to be vaccinated can receive the vaccine. Otherwise, are folks really supposed to just try to avoid COVID infection until their vaccine number is called up in April? I say a fire extinguisher is preferred. Next slide, Dr. Murray. We simply must reconsider the intentional plan that says do nothing until. Until what? It's a mad panic and a rush to the emergency room? The ounce of prevention that's worth a pound of cure is to avoid the ambulance, is to engage in early treatment intervention of COVID before the infection progresses to the point where hospitalization is required. As staggering as the death toll, the numbers do indeed reflect that more are infected and survive from COVID than those who die from COVID. That's true. Nevertheless, there is little comfort in numbers when someone you love and care about is taken from you so tragically, and often without any gift of closure or an ability to share a loving goodbye. Early medicinal intervention in COVID infections is a measure of prevention against the progression of COVID complications. It's critical. Different clinicians have varied approaches toward this end. Some people talk about ivermectin. Some people talk about ICAM and ICAM similar regimens. I have no particular preference. I just want some intervention. I'm simply grateful when anyone recognizes the need to intervene early is undeniable. Next slide. You can't have peace of mind while waiting in line. I have a big what if. Take care of all who want the highly valued prevention effort of the vaccines as soon as possible. But I would ask that we not forget about the folks who already have COVID. Just like the flu vaccines are for people who have not yet contracted the flu, the COVID vaccines are destined for people who have not contracted the COVID infection. Right now, prior to hospitalization, the best effort a COVID patient can obtain is probably thoughts and prayers, because they're told literally to go home and come to the ED if you get worse or sick or have trouble breathing. And sometimes it's just too late. Next slide. The rationale for early treatment intervention for COVID-19 infection. I am assuming that the majority of listeners who stayed around for my conversation may not be prescribers, providers, physicians. But perhaps you'll feel a little bit emboldened to have a conversation with your doctor or your provider. If you should get the unfortunate notice that your COVID test has come back positive, you should want an assessment from your provider. That assessment should align the symptoms that you are experiencing with medications that are FDA approved for the indication. There is medicine right now to treat cough in a manner that preserves lung function. That is a Medrol dose pack, something simple, generic, and inexpensive. Your doctor has to be willing to prescribe it for you. And I'm certainly not going to say that from a PowerPoint, you should let a lady you've never heard of maybe tell you to tell your doctor what to do. But it's worth having a conversation to ask if they would consider it. Now, very often with a viral infection, physicians are hesitant to prescribe steroids because there's a concern that steroids may further suppress the immune system and the virus would not have been able to engage your body, except that your immune system was weakened enough for the virus to feel comfortable making a home there. But immune support would counter that side effect. And I'm going to give you a plug at the end of this as a pharmacist. If the physician assesses your symptoms and decides to support your lung function with a short-term Medrol dose pack, as an example, and gives you some guidance on immune support, then perhaps they could also consider, if they hear lung sounds, that they would automatically give you an antibiotic at their choice. But after they do an assessment, they prescribe. And then they prescribe in a way that allows them to monitor your outcomes. Patients who are not in a healthcare background don't always understand what getting worse is specifically meaning. Particularly in COVID, you should have some guidance. Getting worse, how? Do you mean that when I hold my breath for 20 seconds and I cough, is that time to go? Or when I hold my breath for 10 seconds and I can barely catch my breath? Or is it when I hold my breath for only 3 seconds and I can barely catch my breath? Hint, hint. The 3 seconds is really, really bad. You should have already been in the hospital, at the ED. Maybe the 15 seconds or 20 seconds, but you need clear guidance to know when you need to go to the hospital, and it's important to get there, versus urgent versus emergent. And so I think that when providers say, well, right now you're not showing many symptoms, you can take care of your fever at home, just come to the hospital when you get worse. We need a definition of worse. The physician needs to be clear in giving you that information. I like recommending immune support. Our immune system is our body armor, if you will. And if you have breaks or weakened portions in your body armor, then it's easier for any type of pathogen to get in, bacterial or viral. The product I like the best is Nature-Made Immune Max. Nature-Made Immune Max. It has 2 grams of vitamin C. It has 1,000 micrograms of vitamin D, or the equivalent of that. And I believe it has 20 milligrams of zinc. I haven't seen the product anywhere close to it on the market. And I think it was just released, I think September of 2020. I just found it a couple of weeks ago when I was in Texas with my mom. I think it is the best preventative intervention for COVID imaginable until you can get a vaccine or some other measure. So it's something I recommend as a pharmacist, but I can't be your pharmacist unless you're in Texas or Florida, because I have licenses in those two states. But it's important enough that I wanted to share it with you with this presentation. And I'll close with this. I'm not alone. More and more clinicians have determined that the COVID patient deserves a much more valiant effort at prevention. It has never been that they didn't want to treat the patient with something. However, COVID was so new, most of us didn't know what direction we should go in. That's how they ended up using, a drug that was commonly used for lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and even malaria. We just had not been confronted with something like this before. So my motivation in the absence of a formal study and formal criteria for use is use what we have. We have something to address pulmonary dysfunction. We have meds on the shelf right now to deal with immune suppression. We have something right now to deal with microcirculation issues and the development of thrombus or microthrombus, blood clots. We have something to deal with collateral injury to the lungs in the form of pneumonia. So patients should not have to, as a standard of practice, go home and wait to get worse. So let's not forget about the other ounce of prevention. The ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, absolutely. Beyond comparison is a COVID vaccine, whether you choose a synthetic genetic development or you choose a standard biochemical recreation in the form of a viral protein, a deactivated viral protein. The synthetic genetic materials products are Moderna, we talked about Moderna here, but also Pfizer. And the biological developments are the Johnson & Johnson product and the AstraZeneca product. They're wonderful. We are blessed to have access to them, but we're waiting in line, okay? I'm a healthcare worker, but nevertheless, most people are waiting in line or waiting for their number to be up or waiting for their tier to elevate. So there's another ounce of prevention, the prescription that could be a great alternative to the need for a COVID ambulance. I'm Dr. Carlette Norwood Williams, consultant pharmacist, and I'm privileged to speak with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for those of you who stayed past time, well past time. I hope you felt the information was beneficial and it was worth your time. Are there any questions?
Okay, so we want to thank Dr. Norwood Williams for a very good presentation. And we have a couple of choices here, options. You could put your question in the chat and I will ask it for you, or you could unmute your mic just to ask the question and then, mute again. So I would start with, I think I saw some questions. I have a question from Nicholas. He asked, are natural/organic compounds, in your opinion, better than their synthetic substitutes when it comes to viruses? Because you were, I guess, comparing the Moderna, which is the mRNA synthetic method versus the traditional biologic method. I guess that's part of what he's questioning.
Yes. I am completely uncomfortable sharing my personal preference for which vaccine I would prefer. Because as a pharmacist, I know I carry a measure of authority and I would like for people to make their own decisions. So in answering that question, I don't want to sound disrespectful in any way, but in answering that question, I think the decision should be based upon whether or not you would like to participate in the continuation of a clinical trial for a novel vaccine development that is a messenger RNA vaccine, or continuation of a clinical trial, because it's all a clinical trial now, of the biologic product. The difference is specifically the synthetic vaccine, the synthetic genetic material vaccine, messenger RNA, is so new. We're not completely aware of what the outcomes will be from that. The biologic development for vaccine follows the same procedures and processes for development that the flu vaccine is developed under, that the shingles vaccine is developed under, that the polio vaccine is developed under. So I want to be very careful in saying that I am not choosing for the group which I think is better or safer. I think the intent is, should there be some consequences or side effects that are always possible with any drug, the rationale is that the side effects from the vaccine should be far better than the consequences of contracting coronavirus.
Okay.
Is that a decent answer?
Yes.
And I hope no one's angry with me for that.
Okay.
We're not.
Sandy, do you want to actually unmute and go ahead and ask your question? Sandy?
I already typed both of my questions.
Yes, go ahead and ask
Okay.
your question.
No, I already typed them. I think it's kind of a complicated question. I don't think I would be able to say it well, so I just typed it.
Oh, I found it. I
Okay.
found Sandy's question.
I'll go ahead and read it. What about the burden on the hospitals and pharmaceutical supplies? I think that might be why we were told to wait until it is necessary. What's your view on this? That was the first part.
When you refer to the burden on the hospitals and pharmaceutical supplies, are you referring to the wait for the vaccine?
Yeah, that, and of course, well,
Yes.
just other kinds of like social distancing and
so,
stuff.
All right. So the reason why people have to wait, the vaccine had to be placed in tiers and prioritization, is because of the lack of volume. So when the manufacturers of the vaccine were cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, and preparing quantities of vaccines to go around the world, each country was contacted with a projection of what the manufacturer thought would be needed for a particular country's population. UK is much smaller than us. So the UK was recommended so many.
I meant like actual things, like, as you said, with treating the symptoms and stuff while we wait.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're treating symptoms. No, I literally believe very strongly with physicians I work with now, the hesitation to treat is because there's no published information on what to give. That's the reason.
Oh, well.
Well, no one's telling us for sure what to give. And, you know, a lot of times providers are concerned about litigation.
When in doubt,
And
just don't do it. Like that.
yes, yes. But this is, you know, it's just horrible to send people home when they're, you know, you turn on the television, you turn on the radio, you hear about somebody dying every day. Scores of people die, thousands of people dying every day. So people are concerned.
Speaking of being sent home, oh boy, I actually have a weird story of that one too. Yeah.
Yes, I'm hearing from people every week, every other weekend, who have been sent home and are afraid of what to do. And even some physicians refuse to prescribe a corticosteroid or a steroid that they would normally prescribe for asthma COPD exacerbation, because earlier in the year of 2020, they said don't prescribe any steroids because steroids suppress the immune system. And that's true. That is very true.
Well, I'll just ask out the second part of my question, but like, wouldn't that make it more expensive because a lot more people would be using these products and the demand would go up and, you know, maybe the cost would be way too high for some people. Like, what do you think about that?
I would say absolutely not. Um, Most of these medications have been in the drug pipeline for many, many decades. Vitamin C was approved in 1933. Prednisone was approved in 1955. So these medications are not only standard legacy drugs,
But
they
I
have
mean,
never
they
received a
can, like,
recall.
but I do mean, like,
They're very
if a lot
inexpensive.
more people end up using it, well, I'm not sure if the market would swing that way. I don't know.
No, I think the market would because they've been around for so long. They're so inexpensive. I don't know what they have in that state, but in Texas and Florida, Walmart, for instance, has a $4 list or a $5 list. Each of these medications are on those lists. Very inexpensive. But it's a very good, you're thinking well, you're thinking along the right lines, but at every opportunity, I know for a fact that this is not a challenge. I just think the physicians haven't seen anything published specifically to give them that confidence to move forward. Many doctors have them. I've heard about many physicians, even in Florida and Arkansas, from family members that have called me and they've done very well. And the physician said, "Oh no, I'm not just sending you home to wait." And those family members have recovered within a week, 5 days to 7 days.
Okay,
And
let's get
that's a lot compared to the 3 weeks.
Absolutely.
Let's get another question in. Is a question from Marlene. Basically saying that mRNA is very labile. Do you have any information on how long, you know, the longevity of mRNA?
No one knows, honestly.
Okay.
They're hoping that we'll find out. So here's why there's an emergency authorization to use it, an EUA, emergency use authorization. We're in a public health crisis. So before a vaccine could normally be approved by the FDA, the minimum number of participants in a study needs to be at least 60,000, around that amount. Pfizer, for instance, they submitted their information first for EUA. They only had 21,000 that had the vaccine. It doesn't make them bad. They didn't cheat. We're in the midst of a public health crisis. They turned in records to show we tried this Pfizer vaccine with 42,000 people, but 21,000 were placebo or a pretend drug, and the other 21,000 received the actual vaccine. Of the people that received the actual vaccine, they were okay. They were okay. So that was good enough to allow people to begin to use it. And they allowed the emergency use authorization to do two things: offer some relief in the midst of this public health crisis, number one, and number two, allow them to continue the clinical trial because they still need to get to a larger number of people before they can apply for the final approval of the drug. Now, when you expose people to a study, you have to be prepared for some adverse effects, hopefully temporary, hopefully, non-life threatening, to cause a death. But a study is just that, it's a study. And so the messenger RNA they're in the middle of continuing their clinical trial. But be mindful of this, the biologic produced vaccines, I believe they will be doing the same. Now, I think AstraZeneca said that they will wait until later in the year. If they do that, I think it's because they're shooting for full approval versus emergency use authorization. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so we probably need to wrap up here pretty soon. But I think, and you and I spoke about this earlier today, I think the main message that you have is that vaccines are not the only way out of this. We cannot just rely on vaccines. And in fact, it's a fact that a lot of research labs are vigorously working on getting treatments, creating treatments for COVID. You know, we have seen a lot of attention placed on the vaccines and the creation of the vaccines, the distribution of the vaccines. And the general public, I think, needs to be at least aware that there are other approaches, especially when you have a patient that's infected and, you know, experiencing COVID diseases. So I think that's part of the message we want to give and leave people with in this, from this seminar.
Yes, and I have 2 points I need to make because of questions I didn't get to answer. Number one, I made a recommendation for nature-made Immunimax, but people who are organ transplant recipients cannot take any immune enhancement or immune booster. It can trigger a rejection of the organ. So I want to be sure that I make that very, very clear. It's dangerous for anyone who has an organ transplant to take an immune support or immune enhancement agent. It could cause and trigger, well, it will cause or trigger the rejection of the organ, number one. Immune Max, Nature Made, I love for adults. For children, I don't recommend that. I recommend elderberry, just the gummies for children. Now, someone asked about natural organic compounds. I want to speak to this very quickly. They said, are natural organic compounds, in your opinion, better than their synthetic substitute when it comes to viruses? So I wasn't sure if they're referring exactly to the vaccine itself, or if they're referring to, some people say, oh, I only have natural ginger, or I only get natural vitamin C or whatever. There's a reason why pharmaceuticals were developed and synthesized from plant compounds, because plant compounds, I'm not talking about the virus, I'm talking about plant compounds, in particular herbs, have a potency that can be modified by their environment. I'd love to get all of my vitamins from plants, but depending on where the plant was grown, you don't know what type of sunlight it got. You don't know what type of fertilizer was used. You don't know whether the water was clean, okay? So I am very cautious about natural supplements versus medications in just a few circumstances. So I'm kind of cautious with that. I don't know if that was the answer you were looking for, but make sure you know that do not give nature-made Immune Max or any vitamin C, any immune enhancement to a person that has had liver transplant or kidney transplant. And I recommend children get elderberry and not Immune Max. That's for adults.
Excuse me.
Yes,
If
ma'am.
you said it would not be recommended for people who had transplants and are on suppressants and stuff, but well, people with autoimmune diseases, would you recommend that product to them?
Yes, for autoimmune disease, it should not be a problem, but just to be on the safe side, just ask then ask your doctor.
Okay.
About it. Get direct response from your physician.
Okay, and thanks for answering all these questions.
Oh, sure,
Okay.
Sure.
And we could probably take just one more question. And if not, again, we want to thank our speaker, Dr. Norwood Williams, for a very good presentation, very informative, and a very great way to start off our spring seminar series. Thank you very much. The video of this presentation will also be uploaded as soon as we can, and will be put into YouTube. I'll notify everyone here about how to access it. Okay, thanks again for our speaker and for to our audience as well. Thank you very much.
Can non-AAU students also access it?
Yes, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much, sir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.